Welcome, everybody, to session one of Judaism's ancient and ongoing roots in Israel. I'm Kate Lukaszowicz, the Education Programs Director at Classrooms Without Borders. And in order to cultivate a sense of community today, we invite you to turn on your cameras and to remember that you will be muted during the Zoom. Any questions that you have about this topic, you can forward to Avi through the chat directly. We're grateful today to host educators on our Zoom who are earning professional development credits for their learning. Consequently, the program may differ from what we usually experience with Avi, but he will still be expertly leading the content while he suggests instructional ideas for educators. This offers a novel experience for our community of lay learners to see firsthand the quality professional learning that Classrooms Without Borders offers to its educators. For the educators among us, thank you for making time on a Sunday to join us and for all that you do for your students every day. If you are an educator certified in Pennsylvania, in a few moments, please use the survey link that I'll drop in the chat to record your PPID so that we can report your Act 48 hours. This program, like so many that Classrooms offers, is free for its audience. If you are so inclined, we would be grateful for any contributions that allow us to continue offering high-quality events at no cost. I'll drop that link in the chat in a moment. In today's session, we have the unique opportunity to dispel common misperceptions surrounding the Jewish connection to Israel and to bring nuance to the notion that the land belonged exclusively to Arabs until 1948. In a world where we face unprecedented increase in anti-Semitism, some of it driven by the unfounded narratives that portray Jews as settler colonialists with a history in Israel of just 90 years, it is crucial to explore this topic with depth and clarity to flesh out the truth. A Brooklyn native, Avi Ben-Hur moved to Israel in 1983. Avi's expertise lies in the geopolitical issues underlying the Arab-Israeli conflict, interfaith encounters, world Jewish heritage, and Holocaust studies. As our scholar in residence, Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the United States, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, Spain, Italy, Austria, and Greece for the American organization Classrooms Without Borders. In times when misinformation and misconceptions abound, it is crucial to have knowledgeable voices like Avi Ben-Hur shed light on historical and cultural narratives. We hope today's program will provide you with valuable insights and a deeper understanding of this significant topic. If you have any questions for Avi, please feel free to message him directly via the chat function. Without further delay, I invite my dear friend and most excellent collaborator, Avi Ben-Hur, to share his expertise with us. Please join me in welcoming him to the speaker stage on Zoom.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome, everybody. I don't see most of you because I think most of you have not turned your cameras on, but that's okay. It's your prerogative. For those who don't know me or know of me, transmitting to you from Jerusalem, from Israel. All of you obviously are deeply aware of where we are right now in the midst of a pretty ugly war. All wars are ugly, but this is particularly ugly. And what Kate and I have decided to do is to provide educators context and background so people can actually speak about or understand what's been going on. One of the, I guess, shocking aspects, and I guess it's not something that is new, but it's really revved up recently, is this denial that Jews, the Jewish people, have any historic connection to the land of Israel, to the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And it's quite astonishing. We're talking about the erasure of 3,000 years of history. So what we're planning to do is the following. Today, I'm going to be talking about, as Kate said, the historic connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And I'll be using primarily, but not exclusively, archaeology and historical texts, and even to a certain extent, genetics, to kind of flesh out the really long, millennial long, tri-millennial long connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. In our next session, we'll be dealing with a kind of a bird's eye view, a 101 on the Arab-Israeli conflict at large. And our third and final session will be focusing exclusively on the present war that we're facing at this moment. Okay, so that's the series that we have. And so without further ado, I'm going to be jumping in a moment. I'll be putting up my PowerPoint. But just to give you a sense of how crazy things are going now, we had this past Christmas, which is just really a few weeks ago, several relatively senior American politicians and other public figures who were speaking about Jesus as a Palestinian, and that he was born in Bethlehem, Palestinian city. Okay, and it's actually these are interesting statements. When we open up the New Testament, it is unequivocally clear that Jesus was born a Jew to Jewish parents, was operating 95% of the time among Jews. His disciples were all Jewish, and Arabs are almost not mentioned in the New Testament at all. Palestinians are not mentioned, or Palestine is not mentioned at all in the New Testament, or in fact in any ancient inscriptions you're going to find, or text you're going to find from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But we're finding that we need to relitigate the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, as astonishing as that sentence sounds as it's coming out of my mouth and into your ears. So let's kind of start with a deep dive now. I'm going to share a PowerPoint that I put together for this purpose, which hopefully I'll be able to find quickly. And we will begin. Okay, you should be able to see this pretty soon. For some reason, I'm having difficulty getting to this. I don't understand why. Okay, so slideshow beginning. I'm hoping that you guys are able to see very clearly. Okay, hopefully you guys can see the PowerPoint. I just put up here faces of Israelis, Israeli Jews, actually I should say, because there are Israelis who are not Jewish, because we're talking here about the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And among these faces, you may recognize some of these faces. You're seeing kind of the variety of different types of Israeli Jews we have in Israel today. Some of these people are actually quite famous. Actually, almost all of them are quite famous, but you may not know them. But in any event, you've got here Jews that are emanating from around the world. You have Ethiopian, and you have Moroccans, and you have here Iraqi Jews and Hungarian Jews, and Polish Jews, and Czech Jews, and Austrian Jews. So you have the whole gamut over here, coming from basically all over the world. And we want to do a deep dive into what's the connection about. So believe it or not, the first mention we have of the term Israel is not in a Jewish context. What we have is something known as the Merneptah stele, which is over 3,000 years old. It was discovered in Egypt at the end of the 19th century by British archaeologists. So this is not something that was found by Jews. It's not something that was found by Zionists. Okay, and you can see it, the original one, in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And here we're having a pharaoh who was describing over 3,000 years ago how he was fighting with different groups in the land of Canaan. And lo and behold, there's a sentence here: Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. In other words, according to this Egyptian pharaoh, he managed to eradicate Israel and the Israelites. What's important for our perspective is that we're mentioned. Israel is first mentioned. This is 3,000 years ago, okay? And it's not being mentioned by Israelites or by Judaites or by Jews. By the way, I'm using these terms interchangeably because we're talking about the same people. Here is another one, and this is a little bit later on. This is only 2,900 years old. This was found in Turkey, area of Kurdistan. You can see the original in the British Museum. And here we have some battles taking place between an Assyrian emperor, Shalmaneser III, who is fighting against a coalition of some 12 different kings. And one of the kings here, okay, and he's telling us how many chariots, that's like tanks, right? And how many soldiers this king brought was Achav, or we read in English, Ahab, the Israelite, Achav. The Israelite meaning he's the king of Israel. And if we're going back 2,900 years, we're after King David and after King Solomon, when the unified kingdom collapsed into two separate kingdoms, a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And here we know both from the biblical narrative, but here this is an extra biblical narrative. Okay, I'm deliberately not bringing you quotes from the Bible. I'm bringing you quotes that are external to the Bible, okay, from the enemy, if you will. So this was found, okay, outside of this area in Eastern Turkey. And here it's mentioning a very prominent king of Israel who is mentioned prominently in the Bible. His name is Achav or Ahab. His wife's name is Izebel, or you'd call her Jezebel. Kind of a nasty piece of work, both of them nasty pieces of work, but he's evidently a really, really powerful king, because 2,000 chariots, that's like 2,000 tanks, in antiquity is a very big number, and 10,000 soldiers is also quite impressive. So once again, this is an outside the Bible mentioning of Israelite king by name. And here we have yet another one. And this one, again, I'm sorry, I apologize. This is only 2,800 years old. And this is something that was discovered in Jordan in the middle of the 19th century. There's no Zionism yet. Okay, it's discovered by French archaeologists. And let's take a look and see what we have on this standing stone. Here we go again. We have the mentioning of Omri, also a biblical king, mentioned very prominently in the Bible, descended from Achav or Ahab. And here we're telling about how the king of Israel is oppressing the Moabites, and how Mesha, at the end of the day, is actually going to kick back, is going to push back. I didn't put the entire inscription up here. I just wanted to give you the short form. But the bottom line is, here we have a third extra biblical verification, of individuals who are prominently mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, by name. There's a lot of archaeology locally here that deals with these kings as well, but I deliberately don't want to touch that. I want to touch on external stuff, because, and here I have to say something which I think is very important, and I'll say it in a moment. My fourth piece of evidence was found actually in Israel. It was found in 1993. It was found in a site that some of you may have visited. It's a national park called Tel Dan. And what we have here is the first, and I should say only, mention of King David, or any kind of David, outside the Bible. So we call it the House of David inscription, but it's really the Tel Dan inscription named after what was found. Okay, and here we have the mentioning both of the king of Israel and also king of Judah. It doesn't say Judah, it says of the house of David. Okay, and this is quite important. And all these three, Achav, Ahab, and Achaziahu, and Jehoram, and David, and Yehu, these are all kings, whether Israelite kings or kings of Judah. Remember, these are two Jewish kingdoms that are sometimes working together, sometimes fighting with each other. All these kings are mentioned in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so this is important. Now we have to stop for a moment and say the following. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, Talmud, the Quran, these texts, now let's call them sacred texts, are not history books. These are texts that are books of morality, theology, ethics, the right way to live. In these texts, we have some history, but they're not written as history books. And the tricky part is, how do you tease out of the Bible, whether Old or New Testaments or the Quran, okay, how do you tease out of these sacred texts what is history and what might be a parable? It's not meant to be real history, it's a lesson, it's a moral ethical lesson. And this is something tricky. And what we find is that sometimes archaeology dovetails and works with the biblical narrative, sometimes it doesn't. But by virtue of the fact you have archaeology, you have inscriptions that are outside the biblical text. And these inscriptions, okay, even if the content itself may even contradict the biblical narrative, are mentioning, naming people who are also named in the biblical narrative, this is telling us these are real people. Okay, these are not fables, because here we're having official texts written by kings, okay, and these are not sacred texts. These are their records. So this is the importance. And to make a long story short, what we've seen here is that before and during, I'm going to call it now, Old Testament times, Hebrew Bible times, we have constant, I just brought a few of these examples, constant mentionings of Israel, Judah, names of Jewish kings, okay, who are mentioned prominently. So these are evidently historic figures as far as we understand. I'm fast forwarding a little bit. Some of you have visited Israel and have visited Jerusalem. One of the most impressive sites to visit in Jerusalem is something called Hezekiah's Tunnel. Hezekiah's Tunnel is a water conduit that is cut through bedrock deep under the ground. It's over 435 yards in length. It evidently was cut 2,700 years ago. It was carved out under the orders of King Hezekiah of biblical fame, because he was facing an Assyrian, not Syrian, but an Assyrian with a capital A, invasion by the Assyrian Emperor Sennacherib, who came on a punitive campaign to punish him because he'd rebelled against him. Hezekiah had rebelled against him. This is mentioned in the biblical narrative, the actual campaign itself. Here I've brought you two quotes that intimate that Hezekiah is going to be creating some kind of water conduit. But no less important than this, we have extra biblical verification. What you see in front of you is the so-called, or so-named Siloam inscription. This was found in 1880, also not by somebody Jewish. It is an inscription that dates between 705 and 701 BCE, meaning this is the time of the Assyrian campaign against Hezekiah. And essentially, it's an inscription that was found in the water conduit, was then broken out, and it is sitting in the National Archaeological Museum in Turkey, in Istanbul today. And here it talks about the joy of these two teams that are carving out this water conduit that I showed you before, coming from two different sides. Okay, so we actually have a physical water conduit. We have a mention of it in Hebrew Bible, and we also have an extra biblical inscription in ancient Hebrew, okay, that was found there. But this is not enough, because lo and behold, the British are going to excavate Nineveh, okay, Sennacherib's capital, in the 19th century, and they find his archive. They find his palace and they find his archive. What I'm showing you here, this prism you see, and it's one of 4 that were found. This one happens to be in Jerusalem, but you also have in London, you have a few other museums around the world that have this prism, and the texts are almost identical. And in this text, Sennacherib mentions by name Hezekiah, the king of Judah, same one who's mentioned in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and Sennacherib talks about how he laid siege and devastated 46 of Hezekiah's cities, including Jerusalem. I just gave you the short version here. And he basically imprisoned King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. So we have found 40 settlements or small cities from Hezekiah's time that were burnt to the ground. Based on the archaeology, there's a burn layer at the time this takes place. Jerusalem, Sennacherib does not succeed in conquering. And here we have an extra biblical verification of the story of the siege of the Assyrians on the kingdom of Judah, and specifically on Jerusalem. Okay, so we have archaeology both in Israel, we have archaeology outside of Israel, and here we're talking about something that is real. And again, we're talking about Judah, we're talking about Judaites, we're talking about Jewish people who are living in the country. So this is now 2,700 years ago. We started from 3,000 years ago. We've now moved forward to 2,700 years ago. Now, one of the interesting things about archaeology is that anywhere in the world, you come across a ritual bath that has certain architectural elements, including a minimum amount of pure water, you're looking at a Jewish ritual bath. In other words, if you're excavating in Germany, okay, and you come across one of these babies, you found a Jewish community. This is true of anywhere in the world that you find this, because this is very specific to the Jewish faith. The oldest Jewish ritual baths, which is called a mikveh, or in plural mikvaot, the oldest Jewish ritual baths, mikvaot, that were found in Israel go back 2,200 years. The Hebrew Bible describes that Jews have to purify themselves, okay, under certain circumstances. For example, a woman after she has her period, okay, a man if he has nocturnal emissions. I love that one. If you're going to be pressing olives to olive oil, you have to purify yourself in a ritual bath. So there are all kinds of circumstances under which men and women, Jewish men and women, they're commanded to purify themselves. The Hebrew Bible doesn't describe the mechanism. And the mechanism you see in front of you, the oldest versions we have of this are 2,200 years old. We haven't found older mikvaot. Maybe they exist, we haven't found them. We don't know what the mechanism was before that, but at least we have them going back 2,200 years till today. And we have found hundreds and hundreds of these, actually I should say thousands probably, of these ritual baths all over Israel. Starting from 2,200 years ago, which is the Second Temple period, okay, going all the way down till today. What you see in front of you is a kind of reconstruction on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you're seeing a ritual bath from Qumran, okay, where the Dead Sea sect lived. And that's a community that has a lot of these ancient ritual baths. We have ritual baths all around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So this is something that is really ubiquitous, and it's also national. We have it in the Galilee, we have it in the south of the country, we have them all over the country, okay? And particularly, we have these ancient ones here, okay? So this is also something that is kind of, if you will, kind of proof of concept that Jews were here, because this is something that was very specific to Jews at the time and until today, actually. So this is very, very important also for our purposes. By the way, just taking a step back, going back to the mikvot, I didn't put this up here, I didn't have time, but I assume that all of you, I shouldn't make any assumptions, but I assume that most of you, if not all of you, have heard of something called the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is essentially an ancient library whose texts start 2,250 years ago. And that's the starting point, and the end point is 2,000 years ago. It's an ancient Jewish library. There are 900 Jewish texts that were found there. 3 categories. We have all the books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, with the exception of Nehemiah and Esther, which we haven't found. We found all the rest. We have found apocryphal text, external Jewish books that didn't make the cut, that are not part of the canon. So, for example, the books of Maccabees, the folks who brought us the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, it's not biblical for Jews. It's part of the Catholic canon. It's not part of the Protestant canon. So it didn't make the Jewish canon or the Protestant canon, but it made the Catholic canon. So that's an apocryphal text, external works. And we have sectarian texts that relate to the Dead Sea sect that she found in Qumran. So, and these are written in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and some of them in Greek. And these are exclusively Jewish texts. Okay, and they're going from 2,250 years ago, 2,000 years ago, up until 2,000 years ago. Okay, and again, this is found around the Dead Sea, which gives you a sense that there must have been Jews living there. How about synagogues? Well, we have found approximately 7 synagogues that we can unequivocally date to between 2,200 years ago and 2,000 years ago, meaning when there was a temple in Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem was not a synagogue. We also have synagogues that are contemporary with the temple in Jerusalem. This is one that I suspect many of you have not seen or visited. It was only discovered in 2009. So it's a relatively recent discovery along the southwestern shore of, actually not so much south, the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, in a place called Magdala. Magdala is Aramaic for the Hebrew Migdal. And those of you who are Christians, this should resonate for you after my next sentence. Mary Magdalene. Magdalene is not her last name. It's Mary from Migdal, from Magdala. This is the town of Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' very prominent and important followers. And we have the synagogue that dates to the period of Jesus' activity, more or less. Okay, have Mary Magdalene who comes to this place. You can see on the left-hand side the synagogue, which actually it has kind of benches coming around all four directions. So people assembled. The word for synagogue in Hebrew is Beit Knesset, which means house of assembly. The Knesset, our national assembly. Okay, so the Knesset is to assemble. And what you see on the right-hand side, I'm going to show this to you in higher resolution, is what we call the Magdala stone. This is found in the center of the synagogue. This is an extremely, extremely important find archaeologically. Again, just found a little over a decade ago. Very, very important find, because other synagogues that we found in the country have the same configuration of kind of benches, all four directions, a place you would assemble people. We didn't find in there something that was explicitly with Jewish themes or Jewish symbols. And what was found here in this synagogue was this stone, which actually has carvings on 5 sides, the four sides and the top. And we're seeing, and you're seeing on the left-hand side, what are clearly Jewish symbols. The candelabra you see in the middle, the menorah, was something that was a very, very strong Jewish symbol, which we found on so many objects from antiquity going down to modern times. Not the Star of David, which is a relatively new Jewish symbol that is only as early as maybe the 17th century. Okay, but the menorah, the candelabra, is something we find in ancient Jewish art, okay, going way, way back to at least 2,300 years. So you're seeing here these symbols, and there are other symbols that we found around here, which is really leading us to understand this was a synagogue. So as I said, we found 7 of these synagogues, which are contemporary to Jesus, if you will, from 2,000 years ago, and some of them from 2,200 years ago, which were also contemporary with the temple in Jerusalem. And this is important because synagogues are mentioned in the New Testament. Synagogues are mentioned in inscriptions that were found in Israel from this time, from 2,000 years ago. So this is something that is very, very clear. This is a Jewish institution, which we've had from at least 2,200 years ago till today. This is, by the way, we looked at synagogues that are 2,000 years old. You're now looking at one panel of a synagogue that is only 1,500 years old. So it's very interesting, but in the land of Israel, we have this kind of lacuna where we have no synagogues from more or less the year 70, okay, CE or AD, until about 250. It's like a 180-year period where it's kind of like this black hole. We don't have synagogues, and synagogues begin to reappear, both regionally and in the land of Israel, in the middle of the 3rd century. Prominent, spectacular synagogue, which would be found in Syria, is from the middle of the 3rd century and has a lot of biblical scenes. What you're seeing in front of you here is the upper panel of a synagogue in Tzipori or Sepphoris. Some of you may have visited this national park, which is chock full of ancient mosaics. This one is about 1,500 years old. And what you can see here very clearly, again, are the menorahs, the candelabra. You can see here an incense shovel on the left, and on the right, you see the shofarot, the ram's horns. You see a lulav, which you would use, which we associate with, of course, the Festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot. Okay, lulav here. Okay, these are very typical, and in the center, evidently what the temple must have looked like. So here you see quite a beautiful mosaic, 1,500 years old. We have found over 100 ancient synagogues from the 4th to 8th centuries all over Israel. Just on the Golan Heights, we have found over 20. We have them all over the Galilee, upper and lower Galilees. We have them around Jerusalem. We have them south of Jerusalem in the Hebron Mountains. We found them basically all over the country. And so evidently, there still was significant Jewish community, 5th century, 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, CE or AD in the country. Burial is important when we talk about a human presence, because I have some bad news for all of you. We're all going to die at some point. None of us are going to live forever. And you can tell you have a human presence somewhere when you find cemeteries. Okay, people need to bury their dead. And we have huge quantities of Jewish tombs and cemeteries from antiquity coming down to modern times. And I'm just giving you some prominent examples, which I thought you may be interested in. So these are photographs I took the other day, yesterday actually, in the Israel Museum. This is an ossuary, a bone box for secondary burial. The person was laid out in a rock-cut cave for 11 months till the blood and guts dissipate, and then they gathered the bones together and placed them in this ossuary, this bone box. This one has inscriptions both on the side, as you can see here on the left, okay, and the alongside. It's the same inscription, and it basically says in Hebrew, and those who can read Hebrew among you, you can read this. It says, Simon Boneh HaHeichal, Simon, builder of the sanctuary of the temple. This person, it's a very simple ossuary. It's not, it's not really decorated, with the exception of the inscription. This guy, Simon, was so proud that he participated in Herod the Great's construction or reconstruction project of the temple that he had it inscribed on his ossuary. Okay, this is pretty crazy stuff. I'm jumping forward here to the first Jewish revolt against the Romans, which we call in Jewish history the Great Revolt, which lasted for 7 years, from 66 to 73 CE or AD. There's a huge amount of archaeological finds, but also historical renditions of this. One of the interesting historical texts we have was written by a guy called Tacitus, a Roman historian who was a younger contemporary of the Jewish historian Josephus. Tacitus was about 15 years old when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE or AD. Most of his histories did not survive antiquity, but there are sections that survived, and he actually describes the temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He describes Jerusalem as a great city. Tacitus could not be accused of being a Zionist or a Jew lover. He actually hates the Jews. He writes some terrible things in his history about the Jews. Okay, how we have incest and we kill our children, all kinds of really nasty things about the Jews. But he talks about the Jews living in Judea and talks about the temple. And again, this guy cannot be accused of Zionism. This is if we want to discount Josephus, who historians around the world do not discount, but he's Jewish, okay? And he writes 4 history books, and he describes Jewish life during this period. What you have in front of you are 2 coins of the many coins that were minted by the Roman Empire after they suppressed this Jewish rebellion. What they put on them was the inscription Judea Capta, captive Judea. And what's very interesting, because there are a lot of these coins, what you find in most of them is what you see, I think, and I think the centerpiece is probably most clear to you, is you will see on one side typically a Roman soldier with a weapon. In the center, you're going to see a palm tree. I'll explain why that is in a moment. And then you have, leaning on the palm tree, cowed underneath the palm tree, you're going to have a woman who is typically has her hands bound, either behind her back or in front of her. She represents captive Judah. Palm tree is very interesting because the palm tree in Judaism at that time, 2,000 years ago, represented independence, not just among the Jews. It was a symbol. We talk about Palm Sunday, where Jesus enters Jerusalem and people are waving palm fronds. Okay, it's calling for sedition because the palm tree was a symbol of independence. And here the Romans are saying, independence? No, You're our captives now. And so they minted these coins for quite a long time. So you're seeing two slightly different versions here, and there are many of them. Okay, and what are they calling? They don't, this is a captive Palestine or Palestina, it says captive Judea. Okay. What can I tell you? 62 years after the Jews have their temple destroyed, they rebel again. The second Jewish rebellion against the Romans, we call in Jewish history the Bar Kokhba rebellion, named after the false Messiah, the Jewish leader, Simon Bar Kokhba or Bar Koziba, who led this failed 3-year rebellion against the Emperor Hadrian. The Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote a history about this second Jewish revolt. I've put in parts of it just you see over here. He talks about how Hadrian turns Jerusalem into a pagan city, and where you had the destroyed Jewish temple that had been destroyed in 70, he's going to build a new temple to Jupiter. This kind of pisses the Jews off. As you can see here, the Jews deemed it intolerable, okay, and foreign religious rights planted there. And so the Jews began to organize a rebellion. And basically, the way that the Romans successfully suppressed this Jewish rebellion was by cutting off the food supply, starving the Jews down. And you see here that Cassius Dio tells us that by the end of this 3-year revolt, 580,000 Jews, men, it says men, were slain. That's an insane number. We call it today genocide. That's an insane number of people. I don't know if the number is a real number, but I will tell you what the significance is. The Jews, in the wake of this second rebellion against the Romans, were reduced from being a demographic majority in the land of Israel to a demographic minority. And we only recouped our demographic losses. We only regained demographic majority in the second half of the 20th century. Here we're talking about something taking place at the beginning of the 2nd century. Okay, so for what, 1800 years, Jews had been reduced to a demographic minority. We didn't disappear from the land. I showed you the remains of synagogue mosaic. Okay, there's definitely Jewish presence, but we're no longer a majority in the country. There are no Arabs here. Okay, that's not the point. But the Jews are going to be reduced to a demographic minority in the wake of this terrible, terrible, mistaken rebellion. We have, aside from Dio Cassius, we have some very interesting archaeological remains in this period. I'm showing you just one of them here. There were also a lot of coins that were found and letters. This is actually a weight, part of his administration of Simon Bar Kokhba. You see, Bar Kokhba means son of a star, and that is how he is referenced in some of the Jewish texts. But here he's called Bar Koziba, Ben Koziba, okay? And the Talmud also calls him Bar Koziba, because Bar Kokhba means son of the star, which is intimating that he's the Messiah, but Bar Koziba sounds more like son of disappointment. In any event, this is a weight and measure from his administration that was found. In Judea, we found lots of coins, and we also have letters from this period as well. So this is definitely an historic figure, leading the Jews to revolt. Going back to Jewish tombs, here I'm just showing you a tombstone from the middle of the 5th century CE or AD. The Jews are still present. It's around the area of the Dead Sea. Okay, and this person was a very Greek-sounding name, Megalos, doesn't sound very Jewish, but he mentions here that he dies on the Sabbath, and he uses the month of Tevet, which is the Hebrew name. It's the Hebrew calendar, sabbatical year. Okay, and what's very important is it mentions that it is the year 386 after the destruction of the temple. So this is very interesting because Jews today, the Jewish calendar, counts what year this is since the creation of the world, which, by the way, took place, if you didn't know, a little over 5,700 years ago. Okay, according to the Jewish calendar. What we're seeing here in the middle of the 5th century is that the Jews in the land of Israel, their calendar is based on counting down from the destruction of the temple, so from the year 70. So this is 386 years after the year 70. Very interesting. And you see here that, first of all, it's written in Hebrew. It's written in Hebrew. Secondly, you have the menorah. Again, very common Jewish symbol here. So here we have tomb, and I just gave you one example. There are many, many other examples of Jewish tombs. So there's definitely Jewish presence also in the country in the 5th century. Now I'm jumping forward, with your permission, and we're going to the 12th century. The 12th century, the country, land of Israel, is a Crusader Christian Catholic country. Crusader Catholics coming from Western Europe will conquer the country. At the tail end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th century, they will rule for about 200 years. It's a short period where they've defeated the Muslims. And we have an Italian Jew from Tudela, who is, his name is Benjamin, and he goes on this huge journey all over the Mediterranean basin, including a lot of parts of Southern Europe and this region. And he writes a diary, which we have in its entirety. It's a very, very important document, and he describes everything he sees. But what interests him also is that every place he goes, he counts how many Jewish men there are there, so Jewish families. So it's very interesting because he gives us Jewish demographics of the 12th century, more towards the mid-12th century, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Turkey, in what today is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the whole area, Egypt. He's traveling all over the place, and he counts them. I just gave you some quotes from there. So he's telling us that in the city of Akko, which is like very important Crusader city, there are 200 Jews. When it says 200 Jews, he really means 200 families. Okay, so you're probably looking at more like 1,000 people. Okay, over here, he talks about Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting is in Jerusalem, Jews are not, our understanding is Jews are not really allowed to live in the city when it was a Crusader city. But actually, what we find here is that Jews are living there. They work as dyers, that's their profession, and it talks about, again, 200 Jews living near the Tower of David. That's very, very interesting. Okay, so here's a bit more in the city of Ramle. And Ramle, by the way, is a city that was actually, it's the only city that the Arabs built from scratch, that they created with the early Muslim conquest in the 7th century. Okay, it's going to be built up in the 7th, 8th century as a very important Arab Muslim city. And here he's telling us in this city, you have 300 Jews living there. And in the north, in Tiberias, about 50 Jews living there. So basically what this is telling us is that there are Jews living in the country during this period. By the way, it's very clear to us that Jewish life under the Crusaders was very, very difficult. And there are several thousands of Jews, but the population is thinned out because life is very tough under the Crusaders. I'm fast forwarding. I could talk about what happens after Crusaders. We have different Islamic periods. Under the people who replaced the Crusaders are the Mamluks, and they were very abusive both to Christians and to Jews, and the Jewish population almost disappears. By the end of the Mamluk period, you're looking at about 1,500 Jews in the entire country. It was a very abusive Islamic regime for about 250 years. And then the Ottoman Turks conquer the country in 1517, and they're going to be more tolerant to non-Muslim groups. And what you have here is a photograph of one of 4 synagogues. It's a complex of synagogues in the Jewish quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. The oldest of them are 400 years old. The one you're looking at over here is about 350 years old. Okay, and so we have synagogues, okay, in Jerusalem and around the country as well during the Ottoman period. So I'm stopping the PowerPoint here, and I want to make the following point. From an archaeological perspective, from descriptions of historians, non-Jewish historians and Jewish historians, and Christian historians, I didn't bring them in here to bear, and from sacred texts, and for Muslims as well, by the way, it is very, very clear that we can trace a Jewish presence in the land of Israel from at least 3,000 years ago as a thread that goes continuously for 3,000 years. While it is very true that you're going to have a thinning out of the Jewish population, particularly, okay, and we can put our finger on it. We know when it's going to take place. We're going to have a thinning out of the Jewish population to a great degree under the Crusaders. There's always a presence, okay? And when the first Zionists arrive in the land of Israel in 1882, they're not coming to a place where there are no Jews. They're coming to a place where there are Jews. The Jews are a minority, but they are present. They're there. What's also very important for us to understand is that when Jews begin to arrive in the land of Israel, in Ottoman Palestine, in 1882, there were Jews coming throughout the 19th century and before that, but they were not Zionists. When people started coming as part of a national movement to create a state, starting from 1882, they're coming to what was then a majority Arab Muslim population. Actually, in 1800, in the opening of the 19th century, there were about 250,000 Arabs in the country, and there were less than 10,000 Jews in the country. That's in 1800. When we get to 1882, you're looking at something to the tune of a little more than 400,000 Arabs, mostly Muslims, in the country, and you're looking at 35,000 Jews. On the eve of World War I, you're looking at a situation of about 550,000 Arabs and 85,000 Jews. The Jews who arrived from 1882 forward will be purchasing land from the Arabs with good money, land that the Arabs did not deem to be arable, cultivatable, useful. They considered them to be bad lands. The Jews who had no power, they had no weapons, they were numerically very, very small, did not force any Arabs off their land. They couldn't. Technically, they couldn't. Didn't matter whether they wanted to or not, they technically couldn't actually make that happen. That was impossible. They had no power. And all of the land purchased by Jews from 1882 up until May of 1948, okay, was purchased, not taken away from anybody. It is absolutely true that one of the results of the War for Independence, what we call the War for Independence, it takes place between 1947, 1949, and the Palestinian Arabs call al-Nakba, the catastrophe. One of the results, in addition to about 750,000 Palestinian Arabs displaced from their homes, is that Israel did capture land, okay, that belonged to previous owners who were Arab Palestinians. But that's a result of the war. All of the territory, all of the land that Jews owned, gained between 1882 and 1948 was legally purchased from the owners, wasn't taken from them. What's also interesting is the question, which I think we have to wrap our heads around, and that's the question of, are Jews a nation in the national sense? What's ironic about this question is that if I turn the clock back 300 years, nobody would ask that question. It would be obvious both to Jews around the world and to the non-Jewish majorities among whom or next to whom the Jews lived, that the Jews were a nation in the national sense. Let me restate that in different terms. Starting from more or less the 5th century, Jews who had been citizens of the Roman Empire lost their citizenship. And when the Roman Empire became the Christian Roman Empire, Christian canon law would not allow for the idea that Jews could be citizens or participate politically. And this is going to continue in Christian Europe all the way to the end of the 18th century. And in many cases, all the way into the 19th century as well. Jews living in Muslim countries, and this is true of Christians as well, were defined under Islamic law as dhimmi, as protected peoples of the book, but second-class citizens. Had to pay a poll tax, could never be equal to the Muslims there. And were not full citizens. Theologically speaking, Jews were praying 3 times a day for God to send a Messiah and to return the Jews to the land of Israel. And Jewish theology said Jews could not be proactive in terms of regaining their independence, their sovereignty, until God decided that was the time, sending a Messiah. Okay, what happened 300 years ago, a little less than 300 years ago? 2 revolutions changed things dramatically for the Jews. The early revolution, which actually didn't really impact the Jews that greatly, but is important to everybody who's on this Zoom, was the American Revolution. Because one of the results of the American Revolution was the idea that your religious affiliation had no bearing on your capacity to participate in politics. Jews, for the first time, could be full citizens in this newly minted United States of America, which is very nice, except there were 5 Jews in America in 1789, okay? Now, I'm being facetious, 5 Jews. There were very few Jews in colonial America and in the United States, okay? So it didn't impact that many people. But a few short years later, you have a second revolution, which is much more impactful, and that's the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, basically, the Jews are going to be emancipated, except that, as you well know, the French Revolution implodes under its own weight, under guillotines, and ultimately Napoleon's going to take over. And in 1807, Napoleon, who's now the emperor, convenes the Jewish leadership of France. They're mostly located in Alsace-Lorraine, okay, a border area with Prussia, then Germany later on. And he issues them a list of questions, and you could do a Google search on these questions, but I'm going to paraphrase them now for a moment. Who are you people? Are you French or are you Jews? If your Jewish law code contradicts my Napoleonic law code, which one are you going to follow? If I go to war against the British, will you fight in my army and fight against Jews who are serving in the British army? Who are you people? What are you people? How do you define yourselves? Jews had not been asked this question since they had lost their citizenship of the Roman Empire. And the answer they returned, that they gave back to Napoleon a few years later in 1811, again, you can do a Google search, Jewish response to Napoleon's questions, and I'm going to paraphrase their response. The answer that they gave, the response they gave, they'd never given in all Jewish history. It went something like this: we are Frenchmen of the Mosaic faith. Of course we are French. Of course we will follow your law code. And of course we will fight against British Jews. Our faith is in our home, what we do in our homes, but this has nothing to do with how we define ourselves nationally. That was a game changer because Jews had never said that before. Now, okay, this is France. How many Jews were in France, okay, in the first decade of the 19th century? Well, not that many, but Napoleon, as he conquers all over Europe, he emancipates the Jews in the countries that he conquers. Now, he's going to be pushed back, and a lot of those countries are going to push back the Jewish emancipation, but now kind of the cat's out of the bag, and they can't roll back everything. And so what we're going to find is that in Europe, slowly but surely, throughout the 19th century, Jews will be allowed to be citizens. In other words, Jews had defined themselves as a nation apart. They had a different language in many cases from the majority population. This was very true in a place like Poland, where the Poles spoke Polish and the Jewish Poles spoke Yiddish. This is also true in Russia. They didn't speak Russian, they spoke Yiddish. So Jews were speaking a different language. They lived separately because they, by law, could not live together with the Christian neighbors. They were not allowed to be citizens of these places. And they were perceived by the majority population as not being part of them nationally. And they perceived themselves as being in exile from the land of Israel, theologically speaking, and practical terms as well. They didn't do anything about it, but that's their situation. As I said, the French Revolution is going to change things. Where it will change things? It will change things in Western Europe and parts of Central Europe, but it didn't make any changes for the majority of the Jews who were living under the Tsarist regime, under the Tsarist Empire. Please note, I didn't say under Russia, under the Tsarist Empire, because it would include what today would be Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, large parts of Poland, okay, and other countries. Okay, there the Jews never received citizenship, okay, until after World War I. Okay, so you did not undergo this kind of revolution. This is very important. And there, the Jews were constantly being kept out of non-Jewish, mainstream non-Jewish society. And it's those are the people who, when those societies begin to attack them, and we're speaking now about Tsarist Russia, which attacks its own Jews in 1881, you're going to see a mass flight of Jews. And they're going to be going west, whether we're talking about to Central Europe or to Western Europe, or they'll cross the Atlantic and get to North America or to South America. Okay, they'll be leaving. Most American Jews are a result of that mass immigration of over 2.5 million people who ended up in the United States. Okay, this is true of Jews in most Western countries. Less than 1% of these people started going back to the land of Israel. And it's the beginning of Zionism, because they felt a connection. But the breakdown of the concept of the Jews as a nation in the national sense is going to occur because of the French and American revolutions, and because in Western Europe and North America, Jews can now become citizens and little by little get full and equal rights. Didn't happen overnight. In some cases, it took over 100 years, but it happened. It didn't happen where most Jews were living. So I'm saying all this to you because we want to understand the trajectory. Today, there are many Jews who say, no, we don't feel like a nation in the national sense. There are many Jews who don't necessarily feel a connection to Israel or Israeli Jews. Okay, but the basic concept of Israel, of modern Israel, is that Jews are a nation in the national sense and deserve to have self-determination, to have independence. And what I just said now was recognized by the international community twice, by the League of Nations, the precursor of the UN, which in 1920 basically recognized that the Jews had a right to self-determination and a state, and they basically tasked the British, who had conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, to start to enable the Jews to build a national home, a Jewish national home in Palestine. That's the League of Nations. And the UN, with the Resolution 181 on the 29th of November 1947, partitioned Palestine to two countries, one Jewish, one Arab, recognizing the rights of both. In conclusion, what I want to say at this moment is the following, and we're going to open up to questions, and I see there are some questions. And the things I didn't address yet, but I will do it with the questions. First of all, Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. Indigenous means originate from, come from. This is very clear from archaeology, from history, by the way, from genetics as well. Modern genetic research in the last 25 years is placing Jews at least as far back as 2,500 years in this area of the world. Okay, that's already genetic science. And international law also perceived it this way. We're not a foreign element or foreign colonizers. We are indigenous people that return to their land. And at least until 1948, we did not displace any of the other indigenous people, the Palestinian Arabs, who were also indigenous to the land for all intents and purposes. So at this juncture, I'm going to stop because I've been speaking for a solid hour, and I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. And I'm going to start with what was sent into the chat section. if there were questions. All right. And if not, people can start thinking questions right now. Okay, Al Johnson is asking the following question. You mentioned the number of Jews killed during the Second Revolt. I had read once that Jews comprised as much as 15% of the entire Roman population in the first century. Is that true? So it's very, very interesting, Al, that you read about that, because we estimate that around the year 70, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, that Jews constituted between 10 and 12%, a little less than 15, of the Roman Empire. What's very interesting is that Judaism was becoming a very popular religion up until the outbreak of the First Revolt in 66, for the following reason: because paganism was on the wane. It was bankrupt. People were not buying into that anymore. They were looking for some kind of moral and ethical framework and depth to it. And they were attracted to Judaism because of that. Judaism was a tough religion for them to be attracted to because we circumcised our 8-day-old male children. And if you think about the aesthetics, the Greco-Roman aesthetics, the Jews basically were desecrating their bodies, okay, by cutting off their foreskin. So that was really, really tough for the Romans to deal with. We were also a Jerusalem-centric faith. If you're a Roman, you're living in the greatest city on earth at the time in Rome, how can you possibly be Jerusalem-centric? There were other issues. Keeping kosher, big problem. Okay, big problem because it segregates you from people who don't keep kosher. And the Sabbath, there are all kinds of issues. Having said that, Judaism was becoming more and more popular. And by the way, was a missionizing faith at that time. And also, early Christianity was competing with Judaism. It emerged from Judaism and was becoming more and more popular. In the wake of the Great Revolt, basically Jews were not allowed to proselytize anymore, missionize, and they stopped doing it. Christians did not. They paid a very heavy price for that. And one of the things that Paul did was he basically took away some of the tough stuff, like kosher dietary laws, circumcision, but kept the moral, ethical framework, and that was more palatable for the Roman pagan populace, which is why Christianity began to spread like wildfire at some point, slowly but surely. It spread that way. So yes, evidently there were quite a few Jews, and also what's called Jewish sympathizers. People began to be attracted to Judaism or to monotheism, to the Jewish monotheism. Okay. So Susan's asking, where can you learn more about the history I've outlined? It's a very good question of where we can get an overall history book going from antiquity. So I'm going to think about it. There are a few books that cover it, but you don't have that many that go from antiquity as a straight line through. You'll have ancient Israel, you'll have modern Israel. You don't have a lot of books that cover the whole thing. There's actually one very good book that I will recommend, and I'll have Kate send it out to everybody who registered, and I'll find some more as well. Al's asked the question, how did the Dreyfus Affair impact the move towards Zionism? Okay, so those of you who are not familiar with the Dreyfus Affair, essentially Alfred Dreyfus was a captain, a Jewish captain, French Jewish captain in the French General Command. He was falsely accused of spying for the Germans. The Germans were the big enemies of the French. I'll remind you that the Germans and the French fought 3 wars in less than 100 years. And I have to say that the French got their cans kicked 3 times. The first one was the Franco-Prussian War between 1869 and 1871. And the result of that was unification of Germany and the emergence of Germany. This takes place after that war, 2 decades later. The second was World War I, and the third was World War II. In any event, accusing a French officer of spying for the Germans is really high treason. It's fake news. It's made up. He is convicted. He's sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, not a very pleasant place to spend the rest of your life. It basically collapsed government after government in France, because they had retrials and it was very clear that this thing was made up. but Dreyfus spent 12 years in prison. Theodor Herzl, who was an assimilated Jew, very prominent journalist and playwright, who was based in Paris, covered the Dreyfus affair, the Dreyfus trial, and after Dreyfus is going to be convicted, he's going to be defrocked, his ranks torn off his shoulders, his sword broken in the main square in Paris. And as this is taking place, the Parisian crowds were shouting, "Death to the Jews." Not death to Dreyfus, but death to the Jews. And this was profoundly shocking for Herzl, because, man, 100 years before, this is where the Jews were emancipated. 100 years later, it appears to him, to Herzl, that this had failed. And so the Dreyfus affair definitely had dramatic impact on Theodor Herzl, who was the father of political Zionism. How much impact it had on other Jews around the world, I'm not sure it had that much impact. The majority of the Jews are living under the Tsarist Empire at the time, and they're not citizens, and they're living under bad conditions, and they're being persecuted. They didn't need the Dreyfus affair to know that they're being persecuted. Okay, and Jews living in the Middle East probably didn't even hear about it, or were barely aware of this affair. But it certainly had impact on Herzl, who's the father of political Zionism, and actually succeeded in creating a political mechanism to get the ball rolling. So I see that we don't have more questions here, and I do want to speak about a few things that I think are out there today that you should be aware of, and one of the reasons that we're addressing this. So as I mentioned, as I opened this presentation, that you're having people, the Palestinians love to talk about this, but now it's kind of filtering or bleeding into let's say United States and other Western countries, that Jesus was a Palestinian. Okay, kind of a crazy thing to say, given that there's no such thing as Palestine when Jesus was around 2,000 years ago. Jesus is clearly in the New Testament a Jew. It's unequivocal in the New Testament. And so it's kind of ironic and interesting that Christians would actually say the sentence Jesus was a Palestinian. The idea of what we hear today, 75 years of occupation. So when somebody says 75 years of occupation, they're basically saying that Israel has no right to exist, because Israel's been around for 75 years. If you want to talk about the West Bank and Gaza Strip as occupied territories, that is only from 1967 forward, not from 1948 forward. And those who say 75-year occupation, whether knowingly or unknowingly, they're basically saying Israel doesn't have a right to exist. International law, the UN partitioned Palestine to two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Okay, so this is how the international community viewed it in 1947. And this is legitimacy of Israel for 75 years, not as an occupation. This is important to say as well. But the erasure of a Jewish connection, historic connection to the land of Israel, and claiming that Jews are new arrivals that arrived in this area, okay, only 100 years ago or 120 years ago, this really is fake news. It really is fake news. It's made up history. And more people are buying into this erroneous claim. And this is very, very troubling. And you have a lot of people who are just ignorant, who just simply don't understand. And as I mentioned the past hour, the evidence is overwhelming for a Jewish connection to the land of Israel for thousands of years. It is simply overwhelming. And to deny it is basically erasing facts, evidence, okay? Things that, and I deliberately in my presentation showed you not a few archaeological artifacts that are not coming from a Jewish perspective or an Israelite perspective, or even the land of Israel, that are mentioned from outside players, Assyrians and Egyptians and Moabites, okay? And this is important, or Tacitus we mentioned before, because if it's just Jewish historians or just Jewish inscriptions, well, we can't trust the Jews. They're making this stuff up. But what about non-Jewish, pagan or Christian, okay, or even Muslim mentioning of Jews and their connection to land. What do we do with them? They're not Zionists. They are not Jewish. They can be trusted maybe a little bit more. So we're having, obviously I'm being very, very cynical here and facetious, but my point is that we're now living in a new age where it appears we have to relitigate our right, our connection to the land of Israel, our right to have a Jewish state. And of course, if people want to say that Jews are not a nation in a national sense, they can say whatever they want. I get to define who I am. Just like I can't tell the Palestinians, you're not a real people, you're made up people. I don't have a right to say that. They define who they are. Nobody has a right to define me as who I am, with all due respect. This, of course, is not to mention the fact that we have 7 million Jews living in the modern state of Israel. So what's the message? They're supposed to leave, or they're supposed to go to? You follow what I'm saying here? So all this we're hearing now more and more in the news is very, very troubling. But I think for us in Classrooms Without Borders, it's particularly troubling when we hear these kind of statements coming from teachers. And so the whole idea behind this presentation is to present facts that people can fact check on their own. They can look at all these things and they can see that they're barking up the wrong tree. They really are. This is especially troubling with teachers because they're teaching the next generation. You're not finding a whole heck of a lot of people in the West, in the United States, let's say over the age of 45 or 50, who are buying into this nonsense of no Jewish connection to the land of Israel, okay, and so on and so forth. But you're finding more and more people who are under the age of 45, particularly under the age of 35, who are buying more and more into these ideas, which are completely erroneous and false. And this is extremely, extremely troubling because the bottom line message is that Israel shouldn't exist. Not that there should be, let's say, Palestinian state living peacefully and security side by side by the Jewish state of Israel, but there shouldn't be a Jewish state anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, and this is particularly troubling. Again, what is, I think, ironic and fascinating is when you have people who are Christians who can actually say there's no Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Now, it's not a majority of Christians, but you have some out there, including teachers, and you kind of wonder what they know about their own faith, what they know about their own texts, what they know about Christian historians writing about Jews in the land of Israel. Okay, and so the ignorance is, is not bliss. It's just getting deeper and deeper. So I understand that there are no further questions. And shockingly, we've actually finished ahead of our time. We plan to do this as much as an hour and a half. So Kate, let me pass the baton over to you. I want to thank everybody here who participated, and hopefully we're going to see you. We see you guys, you folks, next week when we do a kaleidoscopic 50,000 feet zoom in on the, or zoom out, I should say, of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Avi, a question came in to me about when would it be appropriate and accurate to describe the land of the territories of Palestine as Palestinian or Palestinian territories? Like, when does that come into usage?
Okay, so I guess the question is, where does the term Palestine come from? When does it enter history? So I showed you the coins, Judea Capta, captive Judea, up until 135 AD. It was called the province of Judea, or Provincia Judea, in the Roman Empire. The Emperor Hadrian, after he suppresses the Second Jewish Revolt, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, is going to rename the province as Syria Palestina. He's going to resurrect the Philistines, and the name stuck from that point forward. The Philistines were sea peoples coming from the Aegean. They are cousins of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians had the northern part of the coast, so the Phoenicians were settling in what today is Syria and in Lebanon. and the Philistines had basically more or less, believe it or not, from where Tel Aviv is today, south into the Egyptian border. Okay, so he resurrected a people that didn't even exist anymore in his time in 135 AD, the Philistines, calling the place Palestina. Now you have to understand very clearly, the Palestinians are Arabs, and Arabs originate in Arabia. The Philistines are Aegean Sea peoples, and they originate from there. Linguistically, geographically, civilizationally, culturally, these are two completely different operas, two different peoples. There's no connection between them, okay, at any level. And that's what's fascinating about the story. By the way, I think that maybe more importantly than about the question, it's an important question that was asked about Palestine. I answered that question, but I think it's no less important to ask about from when do we have an Arab presence in the land of Israel or in Palestine? From when do we have Arabs? Okay, so we have we have small mentioning of individual Arabs, okay, in the southern part, in the Negev, the desert. But these are tiny, tiny groups of people. And really, we have an Arab presence, a real one, that's going to begin with the Muslim conquest of the country in 638 CE or AD. This is when we start to have an Arab presence. They're not a majority at the beginning of the 7th century CE or AD, but over time, and it will take several hundreds of years, the population will become Arabized. What does that mean, the population become Arabized? It means that we ask the question, what is an Arab? Okay, it's an ethnos. Okay, it's based first and foremost on language, on the Arabic language. Geographically, the origin is in the Arabian Peninsula, where Saudi Arabia is today. There is a common language, a common geographic origin, a common culture, but not necessarily a common religion or faith, because for sure most Arabs are Muslims, but there are also Arab Christians, okay, and other faiths, okay. You have Druze who are also Arabs, okay. You have Arabs who are not necessarily Muslims. So Islam is not a defining identifier of Arabs as an ethnic group, but the language certainly is. And here the question is, when do we start seeing Arabic inscriptions in the land of Israel, which would also indicate a presence? I showed you a lot of Hebrew inscriptions. And the answer is, we're not really finding Arabic inscriptions, certainly not in Jerusalem, and certainly not in the area of Judea. In the Negev, yes, but we don't find any of them before the 7th century CE or AD, about 1400 years ago, a little less than 1400 years ago, when we start to see Arabic inscriptions. When I say that the country becomes Arabized over hundreds of years, it means that the local population, which was a Christian majority when the Muslim Arabs conquest the country in 638, will slowly take upon themselves the Arab language. So culturally, they're going to take that. And many of them are also going to end up converting to Islam, because not by the sword, not by force, for the most part, because of economic reasons and political reasons. You couldn't advance politically or economically beyond a certain extent if you were not a Muslim under that regime. Okay, so that will take several hundreds of years, and it's expressed, you see, by the quantities of inscriptions that will be building up over time. So there's very little in the 7th century, and over time we'll see more and more. Okay, so I think that's much more important. It's an important question about Palestine as a name, but asking the question, when do you have Arabs in the country? Fairly late in the game, certainly later than the Jews by far. That is, I mean, 1400 years is a significant amount of time. That makes them indigenous enough, okay? But, you know, and I personally don't think that it's a competition who is there longer, and that gives you more pedigree. It doesn't really matter, because we're now in 2024. We have to deal with 2024, okay? That between the river and the sea, we have equal numbers of Jews and Arabs. That's 7 million on both sides right now. There's parity demographically. That's what you have to deal with in 2024. I'm not sure it really matters how many Jews and Arabs there are in 630 630, right, before the Muslim conquest. I don't think that's really important. There were no Arabs, okay, at that time. It doesn't matter. What matters now, in my opinion, my personal opinion, is where we are in 2024. But since we find ourselves having to relitigate our connection to the land and our rights to the land, so we have to go back. And again, this question of when do we have an Arab presence, I think there's a fairly clear answer. And it's considerably later than a Jewish presence. Any others, Kate?
Not on my end.
Let's see, maybe something in the chat came into chat. Okay. Nope. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. I would love to see your faces, maybe in the next session or two, just on account of a cause. Just seeing names is not satisfying, but you guys can choose. It's your, you're independent, autonomous people. You get to choose if you want to show your faces or not. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you next week for our next session. And we're very interested in hearing your feedback on the session. We want to improve. Very, very important. We want to improve. I want to make sure that you got what you need to get. So thank you very much. Kate?
Okay. Avi, I've got a hand raised. So I'm going to ask Antonio to unmute himself. Antonio?
Yes, I think the frustration that you hear is.
I'll see you.
Oh,
I see. Antonio Bunker. Okay.
yes. I think the
Okay.
frustration, where I get that, is that the war has been long, it's not short, and people are frustrated with that. And also the politics. And I think you're going to discuss that in your third session.
Correct.
Is clouding the judgment of people. But I agree that what is happening and what you see is wrong. That the Jews has been there for a long time. It was promised after World War II. And well, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Antonio.
Thank you.
So
Okay.
thank you, Avi, for that clear and thorough explanation of Judaism's ancient and medieval roots in Israel. I know that we will learn just as much in sessions 2 and 3 over the next 2 Sundays. I did drop a link in the chat if you need to register for next Sunday and February 4th. Your confirmation emails will include the Zoom link to attend the session and pre-reading that is required for any participating educators looking to earn Act 48 credits, and of course is encouraged for anybody who is joining us. Lastly, if you're interested in how we're supporting educators at Classrooms Without Borders, I'll drop a link into the chat for our special edition newsletter with so many resources that were created in collaboration with Avi Ben-Hur. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you stay well wherever you are, and if you're in Pittsburgh, that you're also staying warm.